All right. This is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 7, Creating Republican Governments, 1776 to 1790. We'll be looking at Section 1, Common Sense, From Monarchy to an American Republic. So we just finished talking about the American Revolution and everything that happened during that event, revolution. And an important consequence was that it resulted in the creation of a new country, the United States. This section looks at the different types of governments that potentially the founding fathers, were thinking about using in terms of this new nation here. So, talking a little bit about the ideas. First, particularly in this time period, 1776, late 1700s, really for all of human history, the predominant form of government was monarchy. And a monarchy is, in short, either a king or queen. And of course, if you're not familiar, the way that you become king or queen is essentially you have to be born into it. There's no election process. The king or queen does not represent the people or the lands that they rule. It's just an inherited position. So, king or queen, we might just say based on bloodline. And like I mentioned before, not only was this the predominant form of government in Europe at this time, or even the world at this time, this was historically the predominant form of government, really since governments had ever existed. Now, in the United States, the founding fathers, after having broken away from Great Britain, are going to choose a government other than monarchy. And that's pretty much what all of the founding father types pretty much agree upon. Monarchy is not going to be the option. Not only had the British monarch, King George III, so King George III is the British king the colonies revolted against. Not only did the American colonists believe that King George had been a tyrant himself, given all the events leading up to the American Revolution, but generally speaking, that monarchies in general are not, they don't coincide with Enlightenment principles. We might say about a monarchy, it, does not, let's see, what's a good way of putting it? Monarchies don't put any words. We'll put it this way. Monarchy is not an Enlightenment government, right? And again, if we think about the Enlightenment and some of the key ideas about Enlightenment governments, really this idea of social contract, that a government is a contract between the people and their rulers, government by the people for the people. It's a good way of kind of thinking of it that way. So, monarchies got to go. So what types of governments are available? Well, there are going to be two sort of competing but yet very similar ideas about what government should be. The first one is republicanism, or simply just a republic as a government. And a republic, or republicanism, is a government where people are represented. So there's, representatives of the people who then go into the government, make the laws, and do everything that governments do. This was taken from historical examples of the Roman Republic, which, in fact, had a very kind of similar story. Roman being before the Republic period, being essentially a monarchy or oligarchy ruled by nobles by bloodline. But instead, people would be either appointed or voted for, or some sort of process that there be some form of representation. It was also true that many of the colonial governments, the colonial assemblies, were republics. They had members who were represented. On the other hand, there's also those that favor democracy or a democratic process. Now, even though these are kind of very similar, there is sort of a little difference between the two of them. Democracy can maybe be best described as majority rule. So this might be government where, we'll just say people decide. Government where people decide. Like voting, for example. And of course, the examples from this were, the ancient Greek democracies like Athens. So in most cases, democracies and republics are pretty similar. In fact, the way that representatives are chosen are usually by a democratic process. But countries aren't pure democracies unless it's majority rule. And so, the founding fathers and those in the United States looking to create, again, this new government is, it exists. There's such a thing as a United States now after the revolution. Well, the question is, what type of government should we build? To what extent should it be representative? To what extent should it be democratic? And this is really where they disagreed. So, for example, two different groups, we'll just call them conservative and radical Whigs. A Whig is simply just a term that was used to describe anybody who did not support the monarch, right? It was an older term just used to describe, again, those who are against the monarchy. Conservative Whigs, on the one hand, wanted what we might call, we'll just say, less democracy. And the radical Whigs, we'll just say, wanted more democracy. Because in their eyes, democracy, of course, was a good thing, but it could go too far. So for example, the more people that are part of the process, there's some efficiency that's sacrificed. It's going to take longer to get things done if more people play a part of the process of the decision making. Whereas, on the other hand, if it's just a completely tyrannical system where there is only a single representative that doesn't reflect the will of the people, but things can get done quickly, decision making can get quickly. And we can kind of draw this balance that many of the founding types are trying to perform here. So, you can think of it as kind of like a, like a scale or something, sort of different gradations of it. And on the one hand, we might say this is, this is democracy. On the one hand, we could say, well, we want, more and more and more democracy, but especially those conservative Whigs would make the argument that too much democracy is essentially anarchy, right? Or sometimes what they might describe as mob rule, right? So you don't want everyone participating. You want those participating in the government that are well educated, that have some sort of investment, a stake in the government, want to see the government succeed. So maybe we got to dial back the democracy, but let's not dial it back too far, because if you go too far on this side, you get something like tyranny. And it's sort of this balancing act between the two, creating a government that is democratic enough so not to be tyrannical, but also not too democratic that it's simply just anarchy and mob rule. So this is the balancing act, so to speak. Eventually, we end up at a point of what we call a democratically elected Republican government, right? So we have representatives, but they're elected through the democratic process. We, the people, don't make the laws ourselves. We vote for people, and then those people who are our representatives then make the laws. But again, to what extent should things, again, how democratic do we want things really to be here? So what many believed in this ideal of republicanism, again, government by representatives, was that to have a government by the people, for the people, there needed to be a certain civic virtue among the population. Whenever you hear the word civic, just think civilian. This pertains to kind of everyday people. And of course, virtue is pretty self-explanatory, sort of a morality. And the belief was that, if a government is by the people, then if the people are virtuous, or if the people are good, in other words, not selfish, not corrupt, working in the interests of the collective in some cases, then the government is going to be good. Meanwhile, on the other hand, if the people are corrupt, only self-interested, well, then what's going to happen to the government? Well, the government's also going to be corrupt. So in order for this democracy to work, in order for a government by the people to work, the people have to behave in a certain way that maybe is self-sacrificing in many cases. It was also believed that for those to participate in the government, they needed to have some sort of stake in the game. They needed to have, if you want to use the example of like a craps table in Vegas for gambling, they needed to have chips on the table in order to have a say in the government. And so most founders believed that in order to participate in the government, property ownership was a necessity. So, for example, in many of the early states, those who held office or vote had to be property owners. And again, the logic there was that property owners had a stake in the game. They had chips on the table, so to speak, because if the country failed, then they could potentially lose their property. So they had an incentive to be virtuous. They had an incentive to be educated. They had an incentive to be kind of a well-rounded citizen, so to speak. It was also true that office holders and voters were also exclusively male. We'll talk about that a little bit in the next section, but nearly every single state required people to own property. The example of this, or the best example of this, was George Washington, perhaps. He was considered in many cases to be like the model citizen, so to speak. And the one thing that really set Washington apart, and perhaps the most remarkable thing about George Washington in all of his sort of historical pursuits, from his military antics in the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution to his position as kind of a overseer of the making of the first country, what he did as the first president of the United States. In all of that, perhaps probably the most impressive thing that George Washington did was that he refused to be, quote unquote, the king of America. And that was, at the time, and really throughout history, very rarely do you have people with so much influence and power who refuse to use it, right? And the fact that, the people in the United States would have very easily elected George Washington to be king, and that he turned that power and control down and instead retired, or he thought he would retire, but he went back to his plantation in Virginia only later to become the first president of the United States when the Constitution was written, really is probably the most impressive thing about George Washington. And again, this idea of kind of, self-sacrificing your power in order for a government by the people, for the people to work, again, was kind of that example.